Hello, and welcome to Sleepy Hollow. I hope this video helps you relax and find peace as you settle in for the night. Before you drift off, feel free to share where you're tuning in from and what time you're watching. I love hearing from you, and if this video soothes you, a like and a subscribe would be lovely. Sweet dreams. Story 1. Emma needed a change. After her breakup with Jared, she couldn't stand the silence of their shared apartment. The echoes of his laughter, the faint scent of his cologne on the couch. It was all too much. So when she found the listing for the Maplewood Lane apartment, it felt like a lifeline. The ad was simple. One-bedroom apartment, spacious, quiet building, utilities included, $600/month. Too good to be true, she thought. But desperate times call for desperate measures. The building itself was quaint, with ivy creeping along its brick facade and large bay windows. Emma could already imagine her mornings there, sunlight streaming in as she sipped coffee and read a book. When the landlord greeted her at the door, something felt off. He was a wiry man, his smile too wide, his gaze darting around as if he were looking for something behind her. "You'll like it here," he said, handing her the keys. His fingers lingered just a second too long. "It's a quiet place." Emma brushed off the strange feeling. Everyone was a little quirky, right? Besides, she wasn't looking for a friend. She was looking for a fresh start. The first few days were blissful. Emma unpacked her boxes, hanging pictures on the walls and setting up her tiny kitchen. Felix, her tabby cat, had taken to the apartment immediately, lounging in the sunlight by the bay window. But it didn't take long for the oddities to start. The first thing she noticed was the mug. She'd placed it in the sink after dinner, but the next morning it was on the counter. At first she laughed at herself, chalking it up to exhaustion, but when it happened again and again, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then came the noises. At night, as Emma lay in bed, she heard faint tapping sounds. It wasn't the usual creaks and groans of an old building. This was deliberate, rhythmic, and Felix began behaving strangely. He would sit in the living room, staring intently at the far corner of the ceiling, his ears twitching. Sometimes he would hiss, his back arching as though he were confronting an unseen enemy. "What's wrong with you?" Emma whispered one night, pulling Felix close. But even as she held him, her own unease grew. It felt as though the walls were watching her. Every time she turned around, she expected to see someone there. But there was no one. Just the empty, suffocating silence. By the second week, Emma knew she wasn't imagining things. One morning, she woke to find her bedroom door open. She always closed it before bed, even locking it out of habit. But there it was, shrouded open, the hallway beyond shrouded in darkness. She searched the apartment, her heart pounding, but everything seemed normal. Nothing was missing, yet the sense of being watched had intensified. It was the scratches on the wall that finally broke her. They appeared overnight, deep, jagged marks carved into the plaster near the living room corner. Felix refused to go near them, hissing and clawing at Emma when she tried to pick him up. That night, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of breathing, slow, deliberate, just on the other side of her bedroom door. She held her breath, clutching the covers, her heart racing. When she finally mustered the courage to open the door, the hallway was empty. But the sense of presence lingered, heavy and oppressive. It was Felix who found it. The cat had been pawing at the baseboard in the living room for days, his claws scraping the wood with frantic urgency. At first, Emma ignored him, but one evening, as the tapping in the walls grew louder, she noticed it. A faint draft coming from behind the bookshelf. She moved the heavy shelf aside, revealing the faint outline of a door, its edges hidden beneath layers of peeling paint. Her hands trembled as she searched for a latch. When the door creaked open, a wave of sour, acrid air hit her. The space beyond was small, barely more than a crawl space. Inside, she saw a cot, its mattress stained and sagging. Food wrappers littered the floor, and the smell of rot was overwhelming. But it was the notebook that caught her eye. It sat on a makeshift shelf, its pages filled with frantic scrawls. Emma flipped through it, her stomach churning. Page after page bore her name, written over and over. Mixed in were disturbing phrases. She's beautiful when she sleeps. She doesn't know I'm here. Tonight I'll finally say hello. Emma stumbled back, clutching the notebook to her chest. Her breathing was ragged, her mind racing. She had to get out. But as she turned to leave, the lights flickered. The tapping in the walls grew louder, more frantic, and the air seemed to thicken, pressing down on her chest. And then she saw him. He stepped out of the shadows, his frame impossibly thin, his skin pale and waxy. His eyes were sunken, but they gleamed with a sickening intensity. He smiled, his lips curling back to reveal yellowed teeth. "You're even prettier up close," he whispered. Emma screamed, backing into the hidden room. The man stepped closer, his movements jerky and unnatural, as though his limbs didn't quite work right. She bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The walls seemed to shift around her, the apartment twisting into an endless maze. And then, silence. The next morning, the landlord came to check on her. The apartment was empty. Emma's belongings were still there, but there was no sign of her. On the coffee table sat the notebook, its pages open to a new entry. Scrawled in jagged handwriting were the words, "He's watching you next." Story 2. In the quiet, forgotten town of Black Ridge, the nights were long and silent, interrupted only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of leaves in the wind. It was the kind of town where stories lingered like ghosts, passed down from generation to generation. But one story stood out above all the rest, the legend of the Whistling Man. The tale was simple, yet terrifying. They said he was a ghost, or maybe something worse. He only came out at night, drawn to those who dared to whistle after sunset. The rules were clear: never whistle at night. If you did, he'd hear you. If you heard him whistle back, it was already too late. Most people knew better than to tempt fate, but teenagers always think they're invincible. That's what brought Kyle, Sarah, Megan, and David to the old dirt road that cut through the woods on the edge of town. A dare. A stupid, reckless dare. "Come on, it's just a dumb story," Kyle said, his tone cocky as he kicked a loose rock down the dirt path. He was the ringleader of the group, always looking for the next thrill. Megan, ever the skeptic, rolled her eyes. "It's an old wives' tale. I bet they made it up to keep kids from wandering off at night." "Then prove it," Sarah challenged, her voice tinged with both excitement and fear. She was the quiet one, usually reluctant to join in Kyle's antics, but tonight, something about the stillness of the woods made her want to break the silence. David, the most cautious of the group, shook his head. This is a bad idea, guys. We should just go home." But Kyle wasn't about to back down. He stopped in the middle of the road, turned to the others, and with a smirk, puckered his lips and whistled. The sound cut through the quiet like a knife, a high, lilting tune that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. For a moment, nothing happened. The group stood frozen, their breath visible in the cool night air. And then they heard it. Faint at first, almost imperceptible. A whistle drifted back to them from the darkness of the woods. It was the same melody, note for note. "Who's out there?" Kyle called, his voice faltering for the first time that night. No answer, just the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. Megan turned to Sarah, her eyes wide. "That was... someone's messing with us, right?" David stepped closer to the group, his voice barely a whisper. It sounded wrong, like it wasn't even coming from a person. The whistle came again, louder this time, and closer. The group huddled together, their flashlights darting across the trees. But the beam of light only revealed more shadows, more darkness. And then they saw it. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, stood just beyond the edge of the road. Its face was obscured, but its head tilted slightly as though watching them. "We have to go," David urged, tugging at Kyle's arm. But Kyle, stubborn and determined to keep his cool, shook him off. "It's just someone trying to scare us. I'm not running." He whistled again, the sound sharper this time. The figure took a step forward. "Run!" Sarah screamed, and the group scattered, their footsteps pounding against the dirt as they fled down the road. The whistle followed them, growing louder, more insistent. It was no longer a playful melody, but a piercing, relentless shriek. Megan was the first to fall behind. She stopped, gasping for breath, her flashlight flickering. "Guys, wait!" I say. The others turned just in time to see her look back toward the woods. Her face froze, her mouth opening in a silent scream as the figure stepped into the light. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a smooth, pale void, featureless except for a jagged slit where a mouth should have been. And then she was gone. "We're not going to make it," Sarah sobbed, clutching David's arm.
"Don't stop," he urged, dragging her forward. But the whistle was everywhere now, surrounding them, echoing from the trees. Every time they glanced back, the figure was closer, its movements unnaturally fast, its long limbs jerking like a marionette.
By the time they reached the old bridge, only Kyle and Sarah were left. The structure was ancient, its wooden planks creaking under their weight.
"We have to jump," Kyle said, his voice trembling.
"Are you insane?" Sarah cried, clutching the railing. "We'll die." The whistle came again, deafening now. And then the figure stepped onto the bridge, its head tilting unnaturally as it reached out a long, skeletal hand. Kyle turned to Sarah, his face pale. "I'm sorry," he whispered, before shoving her off the edge. She hit the icy river below, the impact stealing the breath from her lungs. When she surfaced, gasping, the bridge was empty. Kyle was gone. And the whistle had stopped. Sarah never spoke of that night again. When the townsfolk found her the next morning, shivering and soaked to the bone, she refused to say what had happened to her friends. But sometimes, late at night, she swore she could still hear it, a faint whistle drifting on the wind, calling her name. Story 3. The Pinewood Inn wasn't much to look at. Tucked away on a forgotten stretch of highway, it seemed like a relic of a bygone era, a place that should have faded into obscurity long ago, but somehow clung to life. Steve didn't care. He was exhausted, his eyes heavy after a 14-hour drive, and the flickering neon sign outside the inn was a welcome sight. The receptionist barely glanced at him as he walked in. She was thin and pale, with dark circles under her eyes, like she hadn't slept in days. "One room," Steve said, slapping his credit card onto the counter. The receptionist nodded, sliding a tarnished key across to him. "Room 29, Top floor, end of the hall. She paused, her gaze flickering up to meet his. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Don't answer the door after midnight. Steve frowned, unsure if he'd heard her correctly. Excuse me? The woman's lips pressed into a thin line, and she said nothing more. Steve laughed awkwardly, shaking his head as he grabbed the key. Weird place, he muttered to himself, heading upstairs. Room 209 was unremarkable, a generic space with peeling wallpaper and a faint smell of mildew. The bed sagged in the middle, and the single window overlooked the dark expanse of the parking lot. Steve tossed his duffel bag onto the floor and collapsed onto the bed. His eyes drifted to the clock on the nightstand. 11:45 p.m. 15 minutes until midnight. By the time the clock struck 12, Steve was half asleep, lulled by the faint hum of the television and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. And then he heard it, a soft knock at the door. Room service, a voice called, faint and raspy. Steve blinked, sitting up. Room service? He muttered, glancing at the clock. Midnight exactly. He hadn't ordered anything. The knock came again, louder this time. Room service, the voice repeated, its tone strangely flat. I'm David Stern, and MacGyver's expedition. Steve swung his legs over the side of the bed, his heart pounding. Something about the voice felt wrong. It was too monotone, too rehearsed, like someone imitating what they thought a human should sound like. He approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. There was nothing there. The hallway was empty, the light outside his room flickering faintly. Steve exhaled a shaky breath, stepping back from the door. But the knock came again, more insistent, and this time the voice was louder, almost a growl. Room service. Steve's skin prickled with unease. He grabbed the chair from the corner of the room, wedging it under the doorknob. I don't know what kind of prank this is, he called out, his voice trembling. But leave me alone. For a moment, there was silence. And then came the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth outside his door. The television flickered, the screen filling with static. The clock on the wall stopped ticking, its hands frozen at exactly 12:03. And then the voice returned. This time, it was different. Dave, it whispered, soft and drawn out. His breath caught in his throat. How did it know his name? He hadn't told anyone. He stared at the door, his mind racing. The voice came again, louder now, filled with a strange, rasping urgency. Steve, open the door. Steve backed away from the door, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The knocking started again, but this time it wasn't just at the door. It was on the walls, the ceiling, the floor. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, like it was closing in around him. Shadows danced in the corners of the room, moving even though the light remained still. And then, without warning, the door creaked open. The chair he'd wedged under the knob toppled to the floor, and a gust of cold air swept into the room. Steve stared, frozen in place, as the door swung wide to reveal nothing. The hallway was empty, the light outside flickering more violently now. But as he turned back to the room, he saw it. A shadow stood in the corner, tall and impossibly thin, its form shifting like smoke. 2 pinpricks of light glowed where its eyes should have been. You shouldn't have opened the door, it said, its voice a low, guttural rasp. Steve stumbled back, his legs tangling in the bedsheets as he fell. The shadow moved closer, its limbs jerking unnaturally, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. "What do you want?" Steve screamed, his voice cracking. The shadow tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing. "You." Steve scrambled to his feet, lunging for the door, but it slammed shut in his face. He clawed at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The shadow laughed, a low, distorted sound that seemed to reverberate through the walls. "You can't leave," it whispered. "Not until I'm done." The lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness. Steve fumbled for his phone, but when he turned it on, the screen was filled with static. And then came the sound of breathing, slow, deliberate, right behind him. He turned, his flashlight illuminating the shadow's face, or what passed for a face. It was hollow, featureless, but somehow radiated an overwhelming sense of malice. And then everything went black. The next morning, the Pinewood Inn was quiet. The receptionist made her usual rounds, knocking on the doors to wake the guests. But when she reached room 209, there was no answer. She used her master key to open the door, but the room was empty. Bah. Steve's belongings were still there, his duffel bag, his phone, even the half-empty cup of coffee on the nightstand. But Steve was gone. On the desk, written in shaky, smudged handwriting, was a single word: run. Story 4. Jackie never knew her Aunt Edna well. She was the family recluse, the kind of relative people spoke of only in hushed tones. Jackie had met her once, as a child, a fleeting memory of a stern woman with cold eyes and hands that were always busy carving strange little wooden figures. So, when the letter arrived stating she had inherited Edna's estate, Jackie felt more bewildered than anything else. The house was old, secluded, and nestled deep in the countryside, a Victorian monstrosity surrounded by dense woods. Jackie and her husband, Mark, decided to take the kids and make a weekend of it. "We'll clean it up, maybe sell it," Mark suggested. But as they drove down the winding dirt road leading to the house, Jackie couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The house loomed over them like a dark sentinel. Its wooden exterior was cracked and weathered, ivy creeping up the walls like veins. The windows were cloudy, and the front porch sagged under the weight of time. And then there were the marionettes. Dozens of them hung from the eaves, their painted faces cracked and peeling. Some smiled, their expressions frozen in eerie joy. Others scowled or stared blankly into the distance. Their strings swayed gently in the breeze, even though the air was still. "It's creepy," Jackie muttered as they stepped out of the car, but she didn't say it out loud to the kids. No need to spook them. Not yet. The interior of the house was worse than Jackie expected. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew and rot. But the worst part was the marionettes. They were everywhere, hanging from the walls, perched on shelves, even sitting on the furniture as though they were waiting for someone. What anyone need this many puppets?" Mark muttered, brushing cobwebs off an armchair. The kids, Clara and Ben, seemed both fascinated and repelled by the collection. Clara picked up a small marionette with rosy cheeks and a painted dress. "This one's kind of cute," she said, but the moment she touched it, one of its wooden arms twitched. She dropped it with a gasp. Jackie forced a laugh, trying to calm her nerves. "It's just old, probably a loose string." But even as she said it, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. That night, as they unpacked, Jackie noticed something strange. The marionettes seemed to move. Not dramatically, just small, almost imperceptible changes. A puppet that had been facing the window now faced the door. One on the shelf had raised its hand, as though waving. She told herself it was her imagination. After all, the mind plays tricks in a house like this. But deep down, she knew better. It started with whispers. Faint, almost imperceptible, like the rustling of leaves. Jackie heard them as she lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling. At first, she thought it was the wind, but then the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't words exactly, more like the echo of something trying to speak. And then came the movement. Clara woke them one night, her screams echoing through the house. Jackie and Mark rushed to her room to find her sitting on the bed, clutching her blanket. "What happened?" Jackie asked, pulling her daughter close. "They were moving," Clara sobbed. "The puppets, they were walking around." Jackie's heart sank as she looked around the room. The marionettes were all in their places, motionless and lifeless. But as she turned to leave, she could have sworn she saw one tilt its head ever so slightly. "It's just the kid's imagination," Mark insisted the next morning as he sipped his coffee. "This place is creepy, sure, but it's just an old house." But Jackie wasn't so sure. She couldn't ignore the scratches on the floorboards, the faint footprints in the dust that didn't match any of their shoes. And then there was the journal. She found it in the attic, buried beneath piles of old fabric and wood-carving tools. The pages were filled with Edna's handwriting, her words frantic and erratic. "They're alive. They listen to me. They obey. Just. But they're hungry, always hungry." Night. Jackie awoke to the sound of laughter. Not her kids' laughter, no. This was something else, high-pitched, distorted, echoing through the halls. She grabbed a flashlight and crept downstairs, her heart pounding. The living room was alive with movement. The marionettes danced, their wooden limbs jerking unnaturally as they twirled and swayed. Their strings hung from nothing, pulling taut as though controlled by invisible hands. Their painted faces seemed to shift, their expressions twisting into grotesque smiles. Jackie stumbled back, her scream caught in her throat. One of the marionettes turned toward her, its glass eyes locking onto hers. "Stay," it whispered, its voice raspy and broken. "Stay with us." She bolted up the stairs, grabbing Mark and the kids. "We have to go," she cried, dragging them toward the door. But the house wouldn't let them leave. The front doors slammed shut, the locks twisting on their own. The windows rattled, their frames warping as though the house itself was alive, and the marionettes, they followed. Their wooden feet clattered against the floor, their laughter growing louder, more maniacal. The family ran, but the house seemed to stretch and twist, its hallways endless and labyrinthine. "They want us," Jackie realized, her voice trembling. "They want us to stay?" The family was cornered in the attic, surrounded by the marionettes. The puppets moved closer, their strings tightening, their wooden fingers outstretched. "Please," Jackie begged, clutching her children. "What do you want?" One of the marionettes stepped forward, its painted face cracking as it smiled. "You," it said simply. And then the strings came for them. They wrapped around Jackie's wrists, her ankles, pulling her down. She screamed as the marionettes descended, their laughter filling her ears. Mark tried to fight, but the strings wrapped around his throat, silencing him. And then there was silence. When the house was finally found months later, it was empty, except for the marionettes. They hung in their usual places, motionless and lifeless. But 4 new puppets had joined the collection. A man, a woman, a little boy, and A little girl. Their painted faces were eerily lifelike, their glass eyes wide with terror. And if you listened closely, you could almost hear them whispering. Story 5. Jason's phone rang at 9:43 p.m., the screen glowing with two simple words, unknown number. He almost didn't answer. He was exhausted after a long day at work, and telemarketers seemed to have no respect for his evenings. But something about the timing felt, strange. He let it go to voicemail. The phone buzzed again almost immediately. Same number. Same unknown caller. Jason sighed, picking it up. Hello? For a moment, there was nothing, just the faint crackle of static. And then a voice, soft and hollow. Jason. His stomach dropped. The way the voice said his name, it wasn't a question or a greeting. It was a statement, a fact. Who is this? He asked, his voice sharper than he intended. The line went dead. The next call came the following night, 10:17 p.m. this time. Jason was sitting on the couch, a beer in hand, when his phone buzzed. He stared at the screen, dread curling in his stomach. Unknown number. He answered, his voice shaking. Who is this? What do you want? The static returned, louder this time, like a storm raging just beyond the line. And then the voice. Do you remember me? Jason's breath caught. The voice was familiar, but warped, like it was coming through a broken speaker. Who are you? He demanded again, but the line clicked off. By the third night, the calls were no longer confined to the evening. They came at random intervals, in the morning while he brushed his teeth, during meetings at work, even in the dead of night when the world outside was silent and still. Each time the same voice, the same question. Do you remember me? Jason couldn't focus on anything anymore. Every buzz of his phone made him flinch, and even when it was silent, he felt the phantom vibration in his pocket. By the fourth day, he'd stopped answering the calls altogether. He'd blocked the number, but it didn't matter. The calls kept coming. And then the voice changed. It's me, Jason, it said clear as day. He froze. His blood ran cold. The voice wasn't just familiar now, it was unmistakable. Olivia? He whispered. Olivia had been his best friend when they were kids. She died in a car accident when they were 16. This couldn't be real. You didn't forget me, did you? The voice asked, soft and hurt. Jason hung up, his hands trembling, but the phone rang again, immediately, and again, and again, and again. By the end of the night, he had smashed the phone against the wall, its shattered pieces glinting on the floor. But even then, he couldn't escape, because the voice wasn't just on the phone anymore. It was in his head. The memories came rushing back, unbidden and relentless. He and Olivia had been inseparable as kids. She was bold where he was cautious, funny where he was serious. She'd been his best friend, maybe even something more, though he'd never had the courage to say it. The accident had shattered him. They'd been driving home from a party, the rain hammering against the windshield. Jason could still remember the sound of the tires skidding, the screech of metal, the way Olivia's laugh turned into a scream. And the worst part, he'd been the one driving. He never told anyone that he'd been drinking that night, just a few beers, enough to make him careless, enough to take her life. But Olivia couldn't know that. No one knew. So how could she be calling him now? You never told the truth, the voice whispered that night as Jason lay in bed, his eyes wide open. You let me die, and you never told anyone. Jason's world unraveled. He stopped going to work, stopped answering his friends' texts. He boarded up his windows and unplugged the TV, convinced that the voice was watching him through the screens. But no matter what he did, it was always there. Do you remember the way the car smelled, Jason? The rain, the music on the radio? The voice followed him everywhere, in the silence of his apartment, in the hum of the refrigerator, even in the static of the radio he'd tried to destroy. "You took everything from me," it whispered one night. "Now I'm going to take it back." That was when the shadows started moving. At first, they were small, darting in the corners of his vision. But soon they grew bolder. At night, Jason could feel them standing over him, their cold breath brushing against his neck. And then came the reflection. Was brushing his teeth when he saw it. The mirror didn't show his face anymore. Instead, Olivia stared back at him, her eyes hollow, her skin pale and streaked with blood. Her lips twisted into a smile. "Do you see me now?" she asked. Jason screamed, shattering the mirror with his fist, but when he looked down, the shards reflected her face, each piece showing her laughing, screaming, crying. "You can't run," she said. "You can't hide. I'm already here." Desperate, Jason did the only thing he could think of. He bought a new phone and called the number that had haunted him. The line rang once, twice, and then the voice answered. "Jason," it said, almost tender. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, tears streaming down his face. There was a pause, the silence stretching impossibly long. And then, to remember. The line went dead. And when Jason turned around, she was standing there, her broken body twisted unnaturally, her mouth stretched into a grin that didn't reach her dead eyes. The last thing he heard was her laugh as the lights went out. When the police entered Jason's apartment a week later, they found no sign of him. His phone was sitting on the kitchen counter, its screen cracked, a single message typed into the Notes app. I remembered. But the phone had no call history. And the number he'd been calling? It didn't exist. Story 6. Deep in the northern wilderness, there is a forest that doesn't appear on any map. It has no name, no trails, and no end. Those who venture into its depths often speak of a strange phenomenon, glowing eyes that watch from the shadows, never blinking, never looking away. The locals call it the Forest of Eyes. They say the forest isn't just alive, it's hungry. It watches you, learns your fears, and then it tests you. Most who enter never return, and those who do come back changed. The Forest of Eyes wasn't supposed to be on their itinerary. A group of 5 hikers, Liam, the leader, Jenna, his girlfriend, Max, the jokester, Rachel, the skeptic, and Eric, the quiet one, had planned a simple weekend trip through the mountains. But when they stumbled upon the overgrown path leading into the woods, something about it felt irresistible. The trees loomed high above them, their twisted branches interlocking to form a canopy so dense it blocked out the sun. "I've never seen this place on a map," Liam said, studying their GPS. "Looks like it doesn't exist." "All the more reason to check it out," Max grinned. "Come on, where's your sense of adventure?" Jenna hesitated, glancing at the darkened trail. This place feels wrong," she murmured. But the others laughed, brushing off her unease. After all, it was just a forest. What could go wrong? The deeper they went, the stranger the forest became. The trees were unlike anything they'd seen before. Tall, gnarled things, with bark so dark it was almost black, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes, resembling clawed hands frozen mid-reach. But it wasn't just the trees. The air felt heavy, thick with an unnatural stillness. There were no sounds of birds or insects, no rustling leaves or distant streams. Just silence, oppressive and absolute. And then they noticed the eyes. At first they were faint, almost imperceptible, tiny pinpricks of light flickering in the shadows, like fireflies. "What's that?" Jenna asked, stopping in her tracks. The group turned, following her gaze. The lights were scattered throughout the trees, distant and unmoving. "Probably just some weird moss or something," Rachel said, though her voice lacked confidence. But the lights weren't moss. As they continued walking, the eyes grew brighter, closer, and more numerous. They weren't following the hikers. They were waiting for them. It was Max who first noticed that the trail seemed wrong. "Didn't we just pass that tree?" he asked, pointing to a massive oak with a twisted trunk. Liam frowned at the GPS. "We're going in the right direction. It says we should be nearing the river." But there was no river. No matter how far they walked, the landscape remained unchanged. The same dark trees, the same heavy air, the same unblinking eyes watching from the shadows. "We're going in circles," Jenna whispered, her voice trembling. "We need to turn back." But turning back didn't help. The path behind them was gone, replaced by more dense forest. That was when the whispers began. Soft and indistinct at first, like the rustling of leaves. But as the group pressed on, the whispers grew louder, more coherent. "Jenna," a voice called, faint and distant.
She froze, her heart pounding. "Did you hear that?"
"You're imagining things," Rachel said, though her face had gone pale. But the forest wasn't just calling Jenna. Each of them began hearing something different. Max heard the laughter of a child. Liam heard his father's voice. Rachel heard her own name, repeated over and over. And Eric heard nothing at all. They tried to stay together, but the forest wouldn't let them. It started with Max. He stopped in his tracks, his eyes wide as he stared into the trees. "Do you guys see that?" he whispered. The others turned, following his gaze. In the distance, a figure stood among the trees, a small child with long dark hair and glowing eyes. Max, don't..." Jenna started, but it was too late. He took off running, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he disappeared into the darkness. "Max!" Liam shouted, chasing after him. But the forest closed in around them, the path twisting and shifting, until Jenna, Rachel, and Eric were alone. "We need to get out of here," Rachel said, her voice rising in panic. "This place isn't natural." "It's testing us," Eric said quietly. His face was pale, his eyes distant. "It wants to know what scares us." They never found Max. Rachel was next. She heard her mother's voice calling her name, sweet and familiar. She broke away from the group, running toward the sound. Jenna and Eric tried to stop her, but she was too fast. When they found her, she was standing in the center of a clearing, surrounded by the glowing eyes. The eyes moved closer, their light growing brighter, and then Rachel was gone. Not vanished, transformed. A new set of eyes blinked open in the trees, glowing with the same light that had consumed her. "They're not watching us," Jenna realized, her voice trembling. "They're waiting for us to become one of them." But it was too late. The forest had already claimed them. Jenna was alone now. The whispers were deafening, the eyes so bright they lit the forest like 1,000 tiny lanterns. "Please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Let me go." The forest didn't answer. It was Eric who found her, or what was left of her. She stood in the same clearing where Rachel had disappeared, her body frozen mid-scream. Her skin was pale as bark, her hair like moss, her eyes glowing faintly as she stared into the distance. The forest had claimed her, too. Eric emerged from the forest days later, his clothes torn, his face hollow. He didn't speak of what happened, but those who saw him said his eyes were different. They glowed faintly in the dark, like the eyes of the forest were still watching through him. And when he was alone at night, he could hear them whispering, calling him back. What would you like, a concluding narration that ties all 6 stories together into a cohesive anthology? You've heard the stories now. 6 voices, each more desperate than the last, echoing from the shadows of places best left forgotten. But these stories, these whispers in the dark, aren't just entertainment. They're warnings. Warnings of what lurks in the corners of our world. Take the apartment on Maplewood Lane. The silent watcher didn't just want to observe, he wanted more. He always does. And what about the whistling man? He's still out there, his tune carried on the wind, waiting for someone foolish enough to whistle back. Then there's room service. Did you ever stop to wonder who might knock on your door in the dead of night? Did you ever consider that maybe you shouldn't answer? Or the marionette house. The strings that control us aren't always visible, but they're there, waiting to pull us into something we can't escape. The caller knew Jason's secret, just as it knows yours. Secrets have a way of returning, don't they? And the forest of eyes, it's out there, always watching. You may never see it on a map, but if you feel its pull, you'll know. And once it has you in its gaze, there's no leaving. These aren't just tales spun to scare you, they're reminders. The world is full of cracks and shadows, and it's in those spaces that things, unspeakable things, wait for us. And now that you've listened, they know your name too. Be careful tonight. When the knock comes at your door, or the whistle echoes in the distance, or the shadows seem to move just a little too quickly, remember these stories. Because the voices in the shadows remember you. Story 7. The house known as Craven's Rest sat like a rotting tooth on the hill, its silhouette jagged against the horizon. No one ventured too close. Locals claimed the house had a heart of dark, pulsing awareness, and that the second-floor window was its eye. Jeremiah Craven had been its last tenant, a man of peculiar habits and sharp intelligence. Found dead in 1894, his demise left more questions than answers. His journal, unearthed years later by an amateur historian, painted a picture of paranoia, whispers in the night, tapping at the window, and an unshakable sense that something unseen lingered just beyond the glass. Generations passed, and Craven's Rest fell into ruin. Still, the second-floor window remained intact, gleaming like polished obsidian even as the rest of the house crumbled. It watched the world and waited. Eliza Thornton's car bumped along the gravel road, the countryside around her bathed in the muted gold of late autumn. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel, eyeing the envelope on the passenger seat. It bore her great-aunt's spidery handwriting. "The house is yours now. Beware the window." Eliza rolled her eyes. Superstitions were a luxury she couldn't afford. A freelance writer juggling deadlines and mounting bills, she'd driven to Ronsfield with one goal: to assess the property, clean it up, and sell it. The house loomed into view, its form startling even in daylight. Crooked shutters dangled from rusted hinges, and ivy snaked up the walls like veins. Yet the second-floor window gleamed unnervingly, its surface catching the weak sunlight. Stepping out of the car, Eliza shivered. The air was colder here, as if the house exhaled frost. Gravel crunched underfoot as she approached the door. The key was heavy in her hand, its ornate design another relic of a bygone era. The lock turned with a reluctant groan, and the door creaked open to reveal darkness. The smell hit her, first a mix of mildew, wood rot, and something metallic. Eliza flicked on her flashlight, sweeping the beam across the foyer. Dust motes hung in the air like tiny ghosts. The house was a time capsule. Faded floral wallpaper clung stubbornly to the walls, and an ornate chandelier hung precariously from the ceiling. Each step Eliza took elicited a groan from the floorboards, the sound echoing unnervingly. She explored cautiously, noting the decay. The kitchen was cluttered with rusting utensils, and the parlor's furniture was draped in moth-eaten sheets. But it was the staircase that drew her attention. It spiraled upward, each step leading toward the infamous window. As she climbed, the air grew colder. At the top, she froze. The window was larger than she'd imagined, nearly spanning the width of the wall. Its glass shimmered, untouched by dust or grime. It seemed to hum faintly, a vibration she felt in her bones. Eliza stepped closer, her fingers itching to touch the glass. But a sudden noise, a faint creak from above, startled her. The attic, she thought, forcing herself to look away. Eliza set up camp in the parlor, spreading her sleeping bag on the floor. Night fell quickly, draping the house in darkness. She used her phone's flashlight sparingly, saving its battery. As the hours ticked by, the silence grew oppressive. Eliza tried to focus on her laptop, drafting notes for an article, but the words blurred. Her thoughts kept drifting to the window upstairs. At 3 a.m., a sound woke her. Tap, tap, tap. Her eyes snapped open. The tapping was soft, deliberate. She held her breath, listening. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from above. Eliza's pulse quickened. Slowly she rose, grabbing her flashlight. The beam wavered as she climbed the stairs, the tapping growing louder with each step. When she reached the second floor, it stopped. She aimed the flashlight at the window. The glass was undisturbed, yet she felt a distinct pull toward it. Eliza forced herself to back away, retreating downstairs. But sleep evaded her, her mind replaying the sound. The next morning, Eliza visited the town library. It was a quaint building, its shelves crowded with yellowed books. The librarian, Mrs. Havers, was a frail woman with keen eyes. "You've inherited Craven's Rest?" she asked, her tone heavy with disbelief. Eliza nodded. "I'm just cleaning it up to sell. Why?" Mrs. Havers hesitated, glancing around as if to ensure they were alone. "That house, it's not right. Especially the window." Eliza leaned in, intrigued despite herself. "They say Jeremiah Craven spent his final days staring out that window. He claimed something was watching him, something no one else could see. When they found his body, his eyes were wide open, still fixed on the glass." Eliza suppressed a shiver. "It's just a window," she said. Mrs. Havers' gaze darkened. "If you hear tapping at night, don't look." Back at the house, Eliza tried to dismiss the librarian's words, but unease gnawed at her. The second-floor window seemed to have a life of its own. Every time she passed it, she felt its presence, as if it were aware of her movements. Objects near the window began to shift. A chair moved several inches closer to it overnight. A vase she'd left on the floor was now perched on the sill. The tapping resumed, louder and more insistent. One night, unable to resist, Eliza approached the window. Her hand hovered over the glass before pressing against it. It was freezing, far colder than the room. As she pulled her hand away, an oily handprint appeared on the inside of the glass. While cleaning the attic, Eliza discovered a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Inside was Jeremiah Craven's journal, its leather cover cracked with age. The entries grew increasingly erratic. The tapping. Always the tapping. I see them now, faces in the glass, watching me. They want me to open it, to let them in, but I won't. The final entry sent chills down her spine. I can't hold them back any longer. The window is their door. God help me. That night, Eliza woke to a new sound, a faint whispering, like voices carried on the wind. She followed the sound to the second floor, where she found the window open. Her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't her. The face in the glass was gaunt, hollow-eyed, and filled with despair. "Help me," it mouthed. From that night on, the watcher's presence was undeniable. His face appeared in every reflective surface, the kitchen faucet, her phone screen, even the blade of a knife. The whispers grew louder, blending into a chorus of voices. Shadows moved at the edges of her vision, always converging near the window. One evening, Eliza tried to cover the window with a sheet, but it was ripped away by an unseen force. The whispers turned to laughter, mocking and cruel. A storm raged outside, wind howling against the house. The tapping had become a relentless pounding, shaking the walls. Eliza snapped. Grabbing Jeremiah's journal, she hurled it at the window. The glass shattered, and a deafening roar filled the room. Shadows poured through the broken window, coalescing into monstrous shapes. Eliza screamed, backing away as the figures advanced. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the watcher's face, smiling. Eliza survived, but she was forever changed. Back in her apartment, mirrors betrayed her. Her reflection often moved independently, its eyes darting toward the window. And at night, when she glanced outside, she saw the watcher staring back at her, his smile wider than before. Story 8. The old mansion stood at the end of a winding road, a relic of grandeur now cloaked in decay. Once known as Blackthorn Manor, it had been the jewel of the countryside, home to the esteemed Whitlock family. But its fall from grace was steep. By the late 19th century, rumors swirled of strange deaths and mysterious disappearances tied to the house. The centerpiece of the manor was its mirrors, ornate, gilded masterpieces commissioned from artisans across Europe. Each room had at least one, their polished surfaces reflecting light and shadow alike. But locals whispered that the mirrors didn't just reflect the present, they revealed what was yet to come, often in chilling detail. After the Whitlocks vanished without a trace, the house was abandoned, its mirrors left to gather dust. Few dared approach Blackthorn Manor, let alone enter it. But time eroded fear, and when the property went up for auction decades later, a young couple, Peter and Marie, decided to make it their home. Peter and Marie Lawrence were newlyweds looking for a fresh start. Blackthorn Manor, with its sprawling grounds and stately architecture, was a bargain they couldn't resist. "It's perfect," Marie said, her voice filled with awe as they first approached the house. Peter nodded, though his expression was more cautious. The house was undeniably beautiful, but its size and the eerie quiet surrounding it felt oppressive. Inside, the house was a time capsule. Dust-covered furniture filled the rooms, and the mirrors were exactly as described in the property listing: antique, elaborate, and plentiful. Marie was immediately enchanted, running her fingers along the gilded frames. "We'll have to clean these," she said. "They're stunning." Peter hesitated. Something about the mirrors unsettled him. Their glass seemed unnaturally clear, as though they were watching him as much as he was looking at them. Their first night in the manor passed uneventfully, but as Peter unpacked the next morning, he noticed something strange. The mirror in the bedroom reflected Marie standing at the foot of the bed, even though she was in the bathroom. He froze, staring at the image. Marie's reflection was still, her head tilted slightly, her eyes fixed on him in a way that felt wrong. "Peter," Marie's voice called from the bathroom, breaking his trance. The reflection disappeared, leaving only the empty room. Peter shook his head, chalking it up to sleep deprivation. Over the next few days, both Peter and Marie noticed small, unsettling discrepancies in the mirrors. Objects that weren't in the room appeared in the reflections: an old rocking chair, a vase of withered flowers. Once, Peter thought he saw a man's silhouette in the hallway mirror, but when he turned, the hall was empty. Marie began cleaning the mirrors obsessively, convinced that the strange images were just tricks of dirt and grime. "You're overthinking it," she told Peter, scrubbing furiously at the glass. But even she couldn't ignore the way her reflection sometimes lingered a moment too long after she moved. One evening, Marie stood before the large mirror in the living room, admiring her reflection in a new dress. "Do you like it?" she asked Peter, twirling. But Peter wasn't looking at her. His eyes were fixed on the mirror, where Marie's reflection was bleeding. A jagged wound ran across her throat, staining her dress red. "Marie," he shouted, grabbing her. She spun around, unharmed. "What's wrong with you?" Peter pointed at the mirror, but the horrific image was gone. Marie frowned, brushing him off as stressed. But that night, Peter dreamed of the mirror. In his dream, he saw his own reflection reaching out of the glass, pulling him into a world of endless darkness. The next morning, the couple found the living room mirror shattered. The glass lay in jagged shards on the floor, though neither of them had heard it break. Peter swept up the pieces, but as he did, he noticed something chilling. One shard still reflected his face, but his expression was twisted into a snarl, his eyes wild with fury. He dropped the shard, his hands trembling. Determined to understand the house's history, Peter dug through the dusty attic. Among the cobweb-covered trunks, he found an old leather journal belonging to the last owner, Edward Whitlock. The entries were fragmented but chilling. "The mirrors show the truth. They cannot lie. But the truth, it is unbearable. I saw her die before it happened. I tried to stop it, but the glass does not change its story." The final entry was smeared with ink, the writing frantic. "They want us to see. They want us to suffer. The mirrors are the key and the prison." That night, as Marie brushed her hair in the bedroom mirror, she saw something that froze her in place. A figure stood behind her, a gaunt woman in a tattered dress, her eyes sunken and lips cracked. Marie spun around, but the room was empty. When she looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. Peter found her sitting on the floor, pale and shaking. "There was someone in the mirror," she whispered. The mirrors began to dominate their lives. They showed glimpses of the past, the future, and horrors neither could explain. Peter saw himself standing over Marie's body, his hands covered in blood. Marie saw flames engulfing the house, their screams echoing in the glass. Every attempt to cover or remove the mirrors failed. Cloths slipped off during the night, and mirrors they removed reappeared the next morning. In a desperate attempt to destroy the mirrors, Peter smashed one of the smaller ones in the attic. But as the glass shattered, he saw a fleeting image of himself trapped behind the shards, pounding on the glass. A voice whispered from the remaining mirrors, "You cannot escape." On the final night, the house erupted in chaos. The mirrors reflected impossible scenes, endless corridors of darkness, shadowy figures reaching out, and visions of Peter and Marie's deaths. The couple tried to flee, but the house seemed to twist around them, leading them back to the living room. As they stood before the largest mirror, their reflections stepped out of the glass, their faces twisted into monstrous grins. The real Peter and Marie screamed as they were pulled into the mirror, their bodies vanishing into the void. When the neighbors found the house weeks later, it was empty except for the mirrors, which now reflected Peter and Marie, their faces frozen in silent terror. Years later, Blackthorn Manor went up for sale again. A new family moved in, unaware of the horrors hidden in the mirrors. And so, the cycle began anew. Story 9. Music has a way of touching the soul, but some melodies delve deeper, reaching places better left undisturbed. There was a piece of music, known in hushed whispers as the Silent Shore. It was said to be cursed, capable of conjuring spirits that had no voice, only pain. The composition was thought to be lost to time. Its creator, an 18th century composer named Elias Morin, having vanished shortly after its completion. But rumors persisted that copies of the sheet music still existed, hidden away in attics, basements, and forgotten collections. One such copy surfaced in a small estate auction, where it fell into the hands of a young pianist named Amelia Gray. What began as a thrilling discovery would soon become her descent into terror. Amelia Gray was a prodigy. At 24, she had already performed at prestigious venues around the world, her fingers weaving magic over the piano keys. But fame brought pressure, and Amelia found herself yearning for something new, something that would set her apart. That's when she found it. The auction house was small, its items dusty and unremarkable. Amelia was about to leave when a tattered folder caught her eye. It contained sheet music, its edges browned with age. She flipped through the pages, her pulse quickening. The music was haunting, its notes forming complex, dissonant chords. At the bottom of the last page, written in faded ink, were the words, "The Silent Shore." Amelia purchased it on impulse, unaware of the shadow she'd invited into her life. That evening, Amelia placed the sheet music on her piano, her fingers hovering over the keys. She played the first few notes, a melancholic melody that sent a chill down her spine. The music seemed to flow on its own, guiding her hands. The further she played, the more intricate and eerie it became. Chords she'd never seen before emerged, their dissonance resonating deep in her chest. By the time she finished, the room felt colder, and she realized she was holding her breath. "What was that?" she whispered to herself. From the corner of her eye, she thought she saw movement of shadows shifting near the piano. But when she turned, the room was empty. Over the next few days, Amelia became obsessed with the music. She practiced it tirelessly, her fingers aching from the constant repetition. But strange things began to happen. Late one night, as she played the piece, she felt a presence behind her. The hair on her neck stood on end, and her hands faltered. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. There was no reply, but the room felt crowded, as though unseen figures stood just out of sight. The next morning, she found deep scratches on the piano bench, as if clawed hands had gripped it during her performance. Disturbed, Amelia decided to research the music. She visited the university library, combing through old texts and journals. She found a single mention of Elias Morin in a book of obscure composers. It described him as a recluse, obsessed with the idea of capturing human suffering in his music. According to the text, The Silent Shore was his masterpiece, written after he claimed to hear the voices of the dead. Morin vanished shortly after its premiere, and those who attended the performance reported strange occurrences, shadows moving in the corners, disembodied whispers, and an overwhelming sense of despair. Amelia slammed the book shut, her heart racing. That night, Amelia couldn't resist playing the piece again. The melody was intoxicating, its pull impossible to ignore. As her fingers danced over the keys, a faint voice joined the music. She froze, her hands hovering above the keys. The voice was soft, a child's whisper, but unmistakable. "Help me." Amelia stood, backing away from the piano. The voice faded, but the room felt alive, the air thick with an unspoken tension. She didn't sleep that night. The voices grew louder with each performance. At first it was just one pleading, desperate. Then another joined, its tone mournful. By the fourth night, a cacophony of voices filled the room, crying out in anguish. Amelia played faster, trying to drown them out, but the music only seemed to summon more. Shadows flickered along the walls, their shapes human yet distorted. "Who are you?" she cried, her voice lost in the din. The answer came in a guttural whisper. "The choir." Amelia tried to stop playing, but the music wouldn't let her go. When she sat at the piano, her hands moved on their own, as though the keys were pulling her in. Her health began to deteriorate. She barely ate or slept, dark circles forming under her eyes. Friends and family noticed her decline, but Amelia pushed them away, consumed by the music. One night she woke to find herself sitting at the piano, her fingers poised over the keys. She had no memory of getting out of bed. The voices became clearer, their words more coherent. They spoke of pain, betrayal, and unfulfilled desires. Each voice had a story, a life cut short by tragedy. "Play for us," they begged. "Give us a voice." Amelia obeyed, unable to resist the pull of the music. Her hands moved mechanically, crafting melodies that seemed to pull the voices closer. The shadows in the room grew darker, more defined, as if the spirits themselves were taking shape. One figure lingered by the piano, a gaunt woman with hollow eyes and tattered clothing. Her mouth hung open as if screaming, but no sound came out. The sight froze Amelia mid-note. The voices rose in unison, their tone shifting to anger. "Do not stop," they cried. Terrified, Amelia resumed playing. The woman's shadow crept closer, her hollow gaze fixed on Amelia's hands. Tears streamed down Amelia's face as the music poured from her, the notes sharper and more desperate than ever. The next day, Amelia confided in her mentor, Professor Grant, a retired composer with a reputation for studying obscure music. "It's just sheet music," Amelia, Grant said, examining the aged pages. But as he flipped through the notes, his expression darkened. This progression is unnatural," he murmured. "It's almost as if it's designed to evoke." "What?" Amelia pressed. Grant hesitated. A response. "It's as if the music is meant to summon something." Amelia's hands shook as she explained the voices and shadows. Grant dismissed it as stress, but offered to examine the piece further. "Take a break," he urged. "Don't play it again." But Amelia knew she couldn't stop. The music was part of her now. That night, Amelia forced herself to stay away from the piano. But the voices didn't care. As she lay in bed, a low hum filled the room. It grew louder, resolving into the mournful tones of the silent choir. The melody echoed in her mind, each note perfectly clear despite the piano being silent. Then she heard it, soft footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching her bedroom. She froze, clutching the sheets as the door creaked open. A figure stood in the doorway, shrouded in darkness, its head tilted unnaturally, as if observing her. "Why won't you play for us?" it rasped, its voice a chorus of whispers. Amelia screamed, scrambling for the light switch. When the room flooded with light, the figure was gone, but the sheet music lay open on the piano, as if waiting. The next morning, Amelia received a call from Professor Grant. His voice was frantic. "Amelia, where did you get this music?" "I told you in auction," she replied. "Why? What's wrong?" "There are markings in the margins, symbols hidden in the notes," he said. "This isn't just music, it's a ritual. A summoning." "A summoning for what?" Amelia whispered. "The choir," Grant said gravely. "Morin wasn't writing music, he was binding spirits. And by playing it, you're setting them free." Before Amelia could respond, the call cut off. She tried calling him back, but there was no answer. Amelia returned home to find the piano uncovered, the sheet music open to the final page. She didn't remember leaving it that way. The house felt heavier, the air oppressive. Every shadow seemed to move, and the faint hum of the choir filled the silence. Driven by fear and desperation, Amelia sat at the piano and began to play. This time, the shadows didn't just linger, they stepped forward. Figures materialized around her, men, women, children, their bodies twisted and broken. Each one sang, their silent cries blending into the music. "Why me?" Amelia sobbed, her fingers flying across the keys. One figure leaned in close, its face inches from hers. "Because you heard us." Desperate for answers, Amelia drove to Professor Grant's home. She found the door ajar, the house silent. "Professor," she called, stepping inside. The living room was in shambles. Papers littered the floor, and the piano in the corner was splattered with dark stains. On the wall, written in smeared ink, were the words the choir must sing. Amelia backed away, her heart racing. She stumbled over something on the floor, a shattered pair of glasses. Grant's glasses. The chore's demands grew unbearable. Amelia couldn't eat or sleep, their voices haunting her every moment. They whispered constantly, their words a mixture of pleading and anger. Finally, she gave in. She lit candles around the piano, the flickering light casting shadows on the walls. As she began to play, the room grew colder. The air vibrated with energy, and the figures emerged once more numerous than ever. This time they surrounded her, their mouths opening in silent screams. The music poured from her hands, faster and more frantic, as if the piano itself were alive. The final chord rang out, a deafening crash that echoed through the house. The shadows froze, their forms shuddering before dissolving into the air. Amelia collapsed, the room falling into silence. When Amelia woke, the house was empty. The sheet music was gone, the piano untouched. For the first time in weeks, the voices were silent. She tried to move on, but the experience had left its mark. Her once brilliant performances now felt hollow, her hands trembling at every note. One night, as she sat at the piano, she saw it, a single sheet of music tucked into the bench. The title read, "The Silent Choir." And from the shadows, the voices began to hum once more. Story 10. Art holds power. Some believe it can immortalize beauty. Others see it as a means of storytelling. But every once in a while, a piece of art does more than that. It consumes. The tapestry was an enigma, woven centuries ago by an unknown hand. Its threads depicted a sprawling scene of chaos, twisted landscapes, shadowy figures, and grotesque faces. No one knew its origins, but legends claimed it depicted a vision of the underworld. And those who possessed it never lived to tell its full tale. Jonas Merrick was a collector of the rare and obscure. His home was a museum of oddities, ancient masks, cursed relics, and forgotten artifacts. He first heard about the tapestry from an antiquities dealer, who described it as the darkest work ever created. Intrigued, Jonas paid an exorbitant sum to acquire it. When the tapestry arrived, it came in a crate wrapped tightly in linen. The moment Jonas uncovered it, he felt a chill run down his spine. The scene was overwhelming, an intricate depiction of figures writhing in torment, their faces frozen in eternal agony. At the center was a towering, shadowy figure, its eyes glowing red even in the dim light. "It's perfect," Jonas whispered, hanging it in his study.
Jonas spent hours staring at the tapestry, marveling at its detail. It seemed alive, the figures moving subtly when viewed from the corner of his eye.
That night he dreamt of the scene. He was standing within it, the twisted landscape stretching endlessly around him. The shadowy figure loomed above, whispering his name. He woke drenched in sweat, his heart pounding. But as he glanced at the tapestry, he noticed something peculiar. One of the figures, a man, clutching his chest, was now looking directly at him. The next morning, Jonas examined the tapestry more closely. The man who had been clutching his chest the night before was no longer there. In his place was a pair of charred footprints, leading toward the edge of the scene. Jonas rationalized it as exhaustion or a trick of the mind, but the unease lingered. Throughout the day he felt the tapestry's pull. It seemed to dominate the room, its grotesque imagery demanding his attention. By evening, Jonas couldn't resist. He sat before it again, letting his eyes wander over the scene. And then he heard it. A faint whisper, like threads unraveling in the wind. Exercising your supreme expression, it is easy to be rationally sure that your mental motor function is entirely accurate. By no means simplification. This is where most people join us, it said. Determined to understand the tapestry's origins, Jonas visited a library specializing in obscure texts. With the help of an archivist, he uncovered a single mention of the piece in a 16th century manuscript. The manuscript described the tapestry as the weaver's offering, created by a cursed artist who claimed to have seen the underworld during a near-death experience. The tapestry, the artist believed, was a gift to the unofficially warned minds of museums. But every owner of the tapestry had met a gruesome fate, their bodies found twisted and disfigured as if by unseen hands. The manuscript ended with a warning. The threads bind the soul. Do not stare too long. Jonas returned home, his mind racing. He considered locking the tapestry away, but the thought filled him with dread. He couldn't abandon it now, not when he was so close to unraveling its secrets. That night, as he sat before the tapestry, he noticed something horrifying. A new figure had appeared in the scene. It was him. His likeness was unmistakable, his face etched with fear as he stood on the edge of the twisted landscape. "No," Jonas muttered, stepping back. "This isn't real." But as he turned away, the tapestry's glow intensified. The whispering returned, louder this time. "Stay with us." Jonas woke in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps. They were soft but deliberate, pacing just outside his bedroom door. He grabbed a flashlight and crept into the hallway, his pulse racing. The footsteps stopped abruptly. When he reached his study, the door was ajar. Inside, the tapestry pulsed faintly, its threads shimmering as if alive. Jonas froze as a shadow detached itself from the tapestry. It was tall and thin, its movements jerky, like a puppet on strings. The shadow turned to face him, its eyes glowing red. Jonas stumbled backward, slamming the door shut. The next morning, Jonas called the dealer who had sold him the tapestry, but the number was disconnected. Desperate, he reached out to a historian friend, Eleanor, who specialized in cursed artifacts. Eleanor agreed to visit. When she arrived, her reaction was immediate. "You need to get rid of this," she said, staring at the tapestry. "This isn't just cursed, it's dangerous." Jonas explained everything. The whispers, the dreams, the shadow. Eleanor examined the tapestry closely, her face pale. These figures, they're too detailed. It's like they were real people." Eleanor suggested destroying the tapestry, but Jonas hesitated. "What if it fights back?" "Then we fight harder," Eleanor said. "This thing is trying to trap you. Every moment you keep it, you're giving it more power." They decided to burn it. Jonas retrieved gasoline from the garage, and together they carried the tapestry into the backyard. But as they doused it, the whispering grew deafening. Jonas dropped the gas can, clutching his ears. Do it now," Eleanor shouted. She lit a match and tossed it onto the tapestry. Flames engulfed the fabric, but instead of burning, the tapestry began to scream. The fire burned out quickly, leaving the tapestry unscathed. Its colors were even more vivid, the figures more lifelike. Eleanor stepped back, her hands trembling. "It's protecting itself." The tapestry's glow intensified, and the shadowy figure at its center seemed to move. "We can't destroy it," Jonas said, his voice hollow. "It won't let us." Eleanor nodded reluctantly. "Then we need to contain it." Eleanor devised a plan to bind the tapestry. She retrieved a book of protective rituals and marked a circle around the tapestry with salt and candles. As she chanted, the tapestry quivered. its threads writhing like snakes. The figures within it began to scream silently, their mouths opening in unison. Jonas watched in horror as his own likeness in the tapestry moved, reaching toward the shadowy figure. The ritual reached its climax and the room shook violently, but just as Eleanor finished, the candles extinguished, plunging them into darkness. When the lights flickered back on, Eleanor was gone. Jonas searched the house, his panic mounting. In the study, he found her woven into the tapestry, her face frozen in terror. The tapestry had claimed her, and Jonas knew he was next. The shadow emerged again, this time more defined. It stepped out of the tapestry, its long fingers reaching for Jonas. "It's only line," it rasped. Jonas grabbed a knife from his desk, slashing at the shadow, but his blade passed through it harmlessly. Cornered, Jonas realized there was only one way to escape. He turned to the tapestry, staring at his likeness. If the tapestry wanted him, he would face it head-on. Summoning his courage, he stepped toward the glowing fabric. As his hand touched the threads, the world around him dissolved. Jonas found himself in the tapestry's world, a twisted landscape of fire and shadow. The figures surrounded him, their faces contorted with pain. At the center stood the shadowy figure, now towering over him. "You are mine," it said, its voice echoing like thunder. Jonas fought back, but the figures closed in, pulling him into the fabric. His screams joined theirs, his image now part of the tapestry forever. The tapestry disappeared from Jonas's home, reappearing months later in an auction house. A new collector purchased it, marveling at its beauty, but when he hung it in his study, he noticed a new figure in the scene, a man with terror in his eyes, clutching at the threads. And so, the curse continued. Story 11. It began as a low murmur, barely audible, a sound that could be mistaken for the wind, a settling floorboard, or the hum of an old house. But for those who lived in Ashgrove Manor, the whispers were impossible to ignore. The house had been abandoned for years, its history stained with tragedy. Locals avoided it, muttering tales of voices in the walls and shadowy figures that roamed the halls. Some claimed the house spoke secrets about its inhabitants, dredging up memories long buried. When single mother Claire Hughes moved in with her young daughter Lily, she dismissed the rumors. She was too busy rebuilding their lives to be frightened by old stories. But Ashgrove Manor had other plans. Claire parked the U-Haul in the overgrown driveway, the tires crunching over weeds. Ashgrove Manor loomed ahead, its Victorian architecture shrouded in decay. The windows were dark, the shutters crooked, and ivy crawled up the stone walls like veins. "Home sweet home," Claire muttered, forcing a smile for Lily's sake. The 6-year-old clutched her stuffed rabbit, her wide eyes fixed on the house. "It's scary, Mommy." Claire knelt beside her. "It just needs a little love, that's all. We'll make it nice and cozy, I promise." Inside, the house was cold and musty, the air heavy with neglect. Claire set to work unpacking, trying to ignore the oppressive silence that seemed to press down on them. The first night was uneventful, though Claire felt uneasy. She chalked it up to exhaustion and the unfamiliar creaks of an old house. But the next day, as she unpacked boxes in the living room, she heard it, a faint, disembodied whisper. "Mommy," it said, soft and melodic. Claire froze, her heart pounding. "Lily." She found her daughter playing upstairs, blissfully unaware. "Did you call me?" Claire asked. Lily shook her head. "No, Mommy, but I heard someone say my name last night." Claire's stomach churned, but she forced a smile. It's just the house settling, nothing to worry about. Over the next few days, the whispers grew more frequent. They came from the walls, the ceilings, even the vents, always faint, just on the edge of hearing. Claire tried to brush it off, focusing on cleaning and repairs, but one evening, as she scrubbed the kitchen floor, she caught a glimpse of something in the corner of her eye. A shadow moved down the hallway, too large to be Lily's and too distinct to be a trick of the light. "Hello?" Claire called, her voice shaking. No answer. But the whispers began again, louder this time. Claire noticed a disturbing pattern. The whispers weren't random. They seemed to know things, intimate, painful things. One night, as she tucked Lily into bed, a voice drifted through the walls. "It was your fault," it said, cold and accusatory. Claire froze, her mind flashing to the accident, the car crash that had taken her husband's life. She hadn't told anyone about the guilt that consumed her, yet the house seemed to know. Lily's voice broke her trance. "Who's talking?" "No one, sweetheart," Claire whispered. "Go to sleep." But the whispers continued, repeating her deepest regret over and over. "Your fault. Your fault."
Lily became withdrawn, spending hours in her room talking to someone Claire couldn't see.
"Who are you talking to?" Claire asked one afternoon. "My friend," Lily replied. Claire's blood ran cold. "What's her friend's name?" Lily hesitated. "She doesn't have a name. She lives in the walls." Claire tried to hide her fear. "What does she look like?" Lily shrugged. "She's sad. She cries a lot." That night, Claire heard soft sobbing coming from Lily's room. When she opened the door, her daughter was sound asleep, but the whispers were louder than ever. Determined to understand the house's secrets, Claire began to investigate its history. At the library, she found old records detailing a series of tragedies. In 1923, a young woman named Evelyn Green had disappeared, last seen at Ashgrove Manor. In 1957, a family of 4 vanished without a trace. In 1981, a man was found hanging in the attic. His death ruled a suicide. Back at the house, Claire explored every corner, looking for clues. In the basement, she discovered a door hidden behind a stack of rotting crates. It led to a small, windowless room. That night, the whispers became deafening, filling every room. Claire heard voices calling her name, sobbing and laughing. As she lay in bed, something cold brushed against her arm. She bolted upright, her heart racing. At the foot of the bed stood a figure, a pale woman with hollow eyes and tangled hair. "Get out," the woman hissed, her voice layered with 100 others. Claire screamed, but the figure vanished, leaving only the lingering echo of whispers. Lily's behavior grew more erratic. She spoke in a voice that wasn't hers, her words sharp and cruel. "You didn't save him," she spat one evening. "You let him die." Claire recoiled. "Willie, stop!" But her daughter's eyes were distant, unfocused. Later that night, Claire found Lily sitting in the hidden room, staring at the broken doll. "She wants me to stay with her," Lily said. "She's lonely." Claire pulled her daughter away, her fear turning to anger. "We're leaving this house tomorrow," she said. But the house had other plans. As Claire packed their belongings, the house began to lash out. Doors slammed shut, objects flew off shelves, and the whispers turned to screams. In the hallway, Claire saw shadows crawling along the walls, their forms writhing and shifting. "You can't leave," a voice growled. She grabbed Lily and ran for the front door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, drowning out her thoughts. Your fault, your fault, your fault. Desperate, Claire shouted into the void. What do you want from me?
The house fell silent. Then a voice spoke, clear and cold.
Stay with us, forever.
Claire clutched Lily tightly. Take me, just let her go. The air grew still and the shadows retreated. The front door creaked open and Lily stumbled outside, sobbing.
Claire turned to face the house. I'm not afraid of you, she said, though her voice shook. The whispers returned, soft and mocking. You will be. Claire ventured into the hidden room, determined to confront whatever haunted Ashgrove Manor. The walls seemed to close in around her, the air thick with malice.
You want me? She shouted. I'm here.
The room darkened, and the pale woman appeared again, her hollow eyes gleaming. They all stayed, the woman said, her voice a chorus of anguish. And so will you.
Shadows erupted from the walls, wrapping around Claire like tendrils. She screamed, fighting against their grip.
But then she saw it, the broken doll on the floor. She grabbed it, clutching it tightly.
This is your pain, she said. Let it go.
The shadows hesitated, and the whispers faltered. The woman's face softened, her form flickering.
With a final, ear-splitting scream, the shadows dissolved, and the house fell silent.
Claire stumbled out of the hidden room, clutching the doll. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifted. She found Lily waiting outside, tears streaming down her face. Is it over, Mommy? Lily asked. Claire nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure. Claire and Lily left Ashgrove Manor behind, vowing never to return. But as they drove away, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them. That night, as she tucked Lily into bed, she heard it, a faint whisper coming from the walls. Mommy. Story 12. On a windswept cliff overlooking the raging sea stood Eldon's lighthouse, its beam cutting through the darkness. For generations, the lighthouse had guided sailors to safety, its light unwavering even during the fiercest storms. But the locals whispered of an ancient curse. The light must never go out. It was said that the lantern keeper made a pact long ago, trading his soul to protect the town from the horrors lurking in the depths. When the keeper died, another was chosen to take his place. The light continued and the sea remained calm. But if the light ever failed, the ocean would rise in anger, and the creatures beneath the waves would awaken.
Nathan Grayson was a man with nowhere left to turn. A former sailor who had lost his ship and crew to a storm, he sought refuge in the quiet town of Eldon.
When the position of lantern keeper became available, he jumped at the chance. The isolation suited him, and the steady rhythm of the lighthouse felt like penance for his failures. On his first day, the town's mayor handed him the key to the lighthouse. Whatever you do, the mayor said gravely, never let the light go out. Nathan nodded, dismissing the warning as superstition. Nathan climbed the spiral staircase to the lantern room, marveling at the view. The sea stretched endlessly, its waves shimmering under the moonlight.
He inspected the massive lamp, its polished lens and intricate mechanisms, a testament to craftsmanship. Lighting the lantern felt like a ritual, the flame roaring to life and casting its beam far out to sea.
But as night fell, Nathan heard it. A low, mournful sound, like a whale's song. It rose and fell, carried on the wind. Peering out the window, he saw nothing but waves. Shaking off the unease, he returned to his post. Over the next few nights, Nathan noticed strange things. Objects in the lighthouse moved when he wasn't looking. The lantern's flame flickered violently, even when there was no wind. And then there were the shadows. They flickered in the corners of his vision, fleeting but unmistakable. One evening, as he cleaned the lens, he glanced down and froze. A figure stood at the base of the lighthouse, staring up at him. It was too dark to make out details, but the figure's outline was unnatural, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an odd angle. Nathan descended the stairs, determined to confront the intruder. But when he reached the door, the figure was gone. The next morning, Nathan visited the town library, hoping to learn more about the lighthouse's history. He found a dusty journal belonging to the first keeper, a man named Elias Moore.
The entries were fragmented, but one passage stood out.
The sea demands its sacrifice. The light is our shield, but it cannot hold them back forever. When the flame wavers, so do the boundaries between our world and theirs. Nathan frowned, rereading the passage. What did Elias mean by them? That night, a storm rolled in, the wind howling like a banshee. The lighthouse shuddered under the force, and the lantern's beam danced wildly. Nathan worked frantically to stabilize the light, tightening bolts and adjusting the flame. But the whispers began, low and guttural, carried on the wind. You let them die, the voices hissed. Nathan's heart raced. Who's there? A shadow moved across the room, darker than the night outside. Nathan grabbed a wrench, his knuckles white. The whispering stopped, leaving only the sound of the storm. But Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. As dawn broke, Nathan descended the staircase, his body heavy with exhaustion. When he reached the door, he found something chilling. A trail of wet footprints leading from the shoreline to the lighthouse. They were too large to be human, the toes elongated and webbed.
Nathan's stomach turned. He followed the trail to the edge of the cliff, where it vanished into the sea.
Over the next few days, the whispers grew louder. They spoke of the sea, of lives lost, and of a debt unpaid. One night, Nathan heard a voice that chilled him to the core. It was the voice of his former captain, who had drowned in the storm that sank their ship. "Didn't you save us?" the captain's voice demanded. Nathan clenched his fists. "You're not real." But the voices persisted, growing more desperate. "They're coming," one voice said. "The light cannot hold them much longer." The ocean began to change. Its waves turned black and thick, like ink, and strange shapes moved beneath the surface. Nathan watched from the lantern room as a massive shadow passed just below the waves. It was serpentine, its body coiling and uncoiling like a living nightmare. The lighthouse groaned, its walls trembling as if in fear. Nathan knew then that the stories were true. Something ancient and terrible dwelled in the depths. On the seventh night, disaster struck. The lantern's flames sputtered and died, plunging the lighthouse into darkness. Panic surged through Nathan as he fumbled with the matches. Outside, the ocean roared, waves crashing violently against the cliffs. And then he saw them. Figures emerged from the sea, their bodies glistening and malformed. They moved with unnatural grace, their elongated limbs gliding over the rocks. Nathan lit the flame just in time, the beam slicing through the darkness. The figures recoiled, hissing as they retreated into the waves. The next morning, Nathan confronted the mayor. "You knew," he said, slamming his fist on the desk. "You knew what this place was." The mayor sighed. "The lighthouse protects us, Nathan. The light keeps them at bay, but the keeper must pay the price." "What price?" Nathan demanded. The mayor hesitated. "Your soul." That night, the storm returned with a vengeance. The lighthouse shook under the force of the wind, and the lantern's flames struggled to stay lit. Nathan climbed the stairs, determined to protect the town. But as he reached the lantern room, the shadowy figures appeared again, this time inside the lighthouse. "You cannot save them," a voice rasped. Nathan swung his wrench, but it passed through the figure harmlessly. The shadows closed in, their whispers deafening. As the shadows surrounded him, Nathan made his decision. He climbed to the top of the lighthouse, holding the lantern's flame in his hands. "If you want me, take me," he shouted. "But leave the town alone." The shadows paused, their forms shifting. Then, with a deafening roar, they surged toward Nathan, engulfing him in darkness. The flame flared brightly, and the shadows vanished. When the storm passed, the townspeople found the lighthouse intact, but Nathan was gone. His body never recovered. The lantern's flame burned brighter than ever, its beam cutting through the morning mist. A new keeper was chosen, the mayor's warning ringing in his ears. Never let the light go out. Far below the waves, the creatures stirred, their hunger growing. The light held them back, for now. But the sea never forgot its debts, and the day would come when the light would fail again. Story 13. Art is an expression of the soul, a glimpse into the deepest corners of the human spirit. But what if the act of creation could trap more than beauty? The legend of the painted souls began with the enigmatic artist Victor Leroux. A prodigy of the late 19th century, his work was lauded for its lifelike quality. His portraits seemed to breathe. His landscapes seemed to move. But there was a darker truth. Leroux's work wasn't just realistic, it was alive. Every brush stroke captured not just the image, but the essence of his subjects. When Leroux vanished without a trace, his paintings were scattered across the world. Collectors marveled at their brilliance, never realizing the cost of owning a piece of his haunted legacy.
In the heart of modern-day Paris, art student Claire Devall stumbled upon a small gallery tucked into a narrow alley. The sign above the door read "Leroux et Lumière," though the name meant nothing to her.
Inside, the gallery was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of oil paint and varnish. Claire wandered the aisles, her eyes drawn to a massive portrait at the center of the room. The painting depicted a young woman in a flowing gown, her expression serene. But her eyes, they were alive. Claire could have sworn they followed her as she moved. "What do you think?" a voice asked, startling her.
The gallery owner was an older man with piercing eyes. "It's a Victor Leroux original," he said. "Very rare, very powerful." Claire was transfixed. How much?
Claire spent her savings to purchase the portrait. The gallery owner smiled as he handed her the receipt, his expression almost pitying. The painting arrived at her apartment the next day. Claire hung it in her living room, admiring how it seemed to transform the space. That night, as she worked on her own sketches, she felt a strange sensation. It was as if someone were watching her. Glancing at the painting, she froze. The woman's eyes had shifted slightly, her serene expression now tinged with sadness. "It's just my imagination," Claire muttered, turning back to her work. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Over the next few days, Claire noticed small changes in the painting. The folds of the woman's gown seemed deeper, more textured. The background, once a simple garden, now showed faint outlines of trees. One evening, while tidying up, Claire accidentally knocked over a glass of wine. It splashed onto the painting, staining the corner red.
Panic surged through her. She grabbed a cloth, dabbing at the canvas. As the stain disappeared, Claire felt a sharp pain in her hand. Looking down, she saw a deep cut across her palm. She hadn't touched anything sharp.
That night, Claire dreamt of the woman in the painting. She stood in the same garden, but the air was heavy and oppressive. "Help me," the woman whispered, her voice trembling. Claire tried to approach, but the garden shifted, the trees twisting into dark shapes. The woman's serene face contorted into a mask of terror as unseen hands dragged her into the shadows.
Claire woke, gasping for air.
The painting hung on the wall, unchanged, but the woman's eyes seemed to hold a glint of desperation. Claire's own artwork began to change. Her sketches grew darker, more detailed, as if an unseen hand guided her. She painted obsessively, her brush strokes frantic. Her friends noticed the change. "Your work is incredible," her classmate Elise said, "but it's different, almost too real." Claire brushed off the comment, though doubt gnawed at her. One afternoon, as she painted, she heard a faint whisper. "Free me." She spun around, but the apartment was empty. The whisper came again, louder. It was coming from the painting.
Determined to understand what was happening, Claire researched Victor Leroux. She discovered old newspaper clippings detailing his disappearance and rumors of his cursed paintings.
One article mentioned a collector who claimed the paintings held the souls of Leroux's subjects.
The artist made a pact, the collector was quoted as saying. He captured their souls to achieve perfection, but perfection comes at a price.
Claire's stomach churned. Was the woman in her painting alive, trapped within the canvas? Claire tried to distance herself from the painting, covering it with a cloth, but the whispers continued, growing more insistent. One night, she woke to find the cloth on the floor. The painting was exposed, and the woman's face had changed again, her serene expression now one of pain. "Won't you help me?" The woman's voice echoed in Claire's mind.
Terrified, Claire tried to remove the painting from her apartment, but as she carried it down the stairs, she tripped, tumbling to the floor. The painting landed upright, undamaged.
Claire stared at it, her fear turning to resolve. "I'll help you," she whispered. Claire returned to the gallery, demanding answers. The owner sighed, as if expecting her. "Leroux's work is not ordinary," he admitted. "He found a way to bind souls to his paintings. It was his gift and his curse." "How do I free her?" Claire asked. The owner hesitated. "You must destroy the painting. But be warned, the soul within may not be grateful, and Leroux's creations do not die easily." Back at her apartment, Claire prepared to burn the painting. She placed it in the fireplace, her hands trembling as she struck a match. As the flames licked the edges of the canvas, the woman's face twisted in agony. "No!" she screamed, her voice echoing in the room. The fire roared, but the painting remained intact. Shadows spilled from the canvas, coiling around Claire like living things. "You can't destroy me," the woman hissed. "You'll take my place." The shadows dragged Claire into the painting, the world shifting around her. She found herself in the garden from her dreams, the air thick with despair. The woman stood before her, no longer serene. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow. "This is my prison," she said, "and now it's yours." Claire tried to run, but the garden closed in. the trees forming a cage. As Claire struggled, a new figure appeared, a man with piercing eyes and paint-stained hands. "Labru," Claire whispered. The artist smiled faintly. "You understand now, don't you? Art requires sacrifice." "You did this," Claire said, her voice trembling. "You trapped her." "I gave her immortality," LaRue replied, "and now I offer the same to you." Claire refused to accept her fate. She grabbed a shard of broken glass from the ground and slashed at the shadows. The woman screamed, her form flickering. LaRue stepped back, his expression turning to rage.
"You cannot break the pact," he bellowed.
But Claire kept fighting, her determination burning brighter than the darkness. With one final strike, Claire severed the shadowy tendrils holding the woman. The garden dissolved, the painting's power breaking. Claire awoke in her apartment, the painting lying in tatters on the floor. The woman's face was gone, her soul finally free. Claire left the apartment, vowing never to touch another LaRue painting. But as she walked through the city, she noticed other portraits in galleries and museums, each one holding eyes that seemed too alive. Victor LaRue's work endured, his curse spreading through every canvas he ever touched. And Claire couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching. Story 14. Every town has its myths, and the residents of Bramble Hollow feared the Whispering Woods. It was an ancient forest that stretched for miles, its dense canopy blocking even the brightest sunlight. The whispers were what made it infamous. Travelers who ventured too close claimed they heard voices calling their names, luring them deeper into the woods. Those who followed the voices were never seen again. Locals spoke of the forest as if it were alive, a sentient, malevolent thing that preyed on curiosity. But for years, the whispers remained a story to frighten children, until one autumn day when a group of hikers vanished without a trace. 5 friends set out on a weekend hike. Ethan, the self-proclaimed leader, Grace, the adventurous photographer, Liam, the quiet observer, Megan, the skeptic, and Emily, the cautious one. Their trail led them through the outskirts of the Whispering Woods. Despite the stories, Ethan brushed off the warnings. "It's just a forest," he said. "We'll be fine." The group laughed, their spirits high as they entered the woods. But as the sun began to set, a strange stillness settled over the forest. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just an eerie, unnatural silence. Then the whispers began.
The group set up camp in a small clearing, their laughter masking their unease. Grace snapped photos of the towering trees, marveling at their size.
But as darkness fell, the whispers grew louder. They were faint at first, like the wind rustling through leaves. "Do you hear that?" Emily asked, her voice trembling.
"It's nothing," Megan said, rolling her eyes. "Just the wind."
But as the night wore on, the whispers grew clearer. They weren't random noises. They were voices, distinct in calling their names. The next morning, Grace was gone. The group searched frantically, calling her name. Her camera was still in her tent, but there was no sign of her. "She wouldn't just wander off," Emily said, panic rising in her voice. Liam found a trail of footprints leading deeper into the woods. "She must have gone this way," he said. Reluctantly, the group followed the trail, but the deeper they went, the louder the whispers became. The trail led them to an ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches twisting like skeletal fingers. Carved into the bark was a message.
"Turn back now."
Megan scoffed. "Someone's playing a prank." But Emily's unease grew. She noticed something strange about the ground beneath the tree. It was littered with small, bleached bones. "We need to leave," she said. But Ethan was determined to find Grace. "We can't just abandon her," he said, pushing onward. As they ventured deeper, the forest seemed to change. The trees grew taller and more twisted, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sunlight. The whispers grew louder, blending into a cacophony of voices. "They're watching us," Emily whispered, glancing over her shoulder. Liam froze. "Who?"
In the distance, shadowy figures moved between the trees. They were human-like, but wrong. Their limbs too long, their movements too fluid.
"They're not real." "Oh," Megan said, her voice wavering. "They can't be."
But when one of the figures turned its head, its hollow eyes locked onto her.
The group stumbled upon another clearing, this one marked by strange symbols carved into the ground. "What is this?" Ethan asked, kneeling to examine the patterns.
Emily shuddered. "It's a warning."
The symbols pulsed faintly, as if alive. As the group studied them, the whispers shifted, forming words. "Stay with us." Megan screamed as a hand brushed her shoulder, but when she turned, no one was there. That night, as the group huddled around the fire, Grace emerged from the shadows. "Grace," Ethan shouted, running to her. But something was wrong. Her eyes were glassy, her movements stiff. She didn't speak, only stared at them, with a vacant expression. "Where were you?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Grace tilted her head, a slow, unnatural motion. Then she smiled, a wide, too-perfect grin. "She's not Grace," Liam whispered. Before anyone could react, the fire extinguished, plunging them into darkness.
The group scattered, running blindly through the woods as the whispers grew deafening.
Emily tripped over a root, her flashlight flickering. When she looked up, one of the shadowy figures loomed over her, its face featureless. "Emily," it rasped, mimicking her own voice. She scrambled to her feet, rejoining the others as they regrouped near a creek. "We can't keep running," Ethan said, his face pale. "We need to fight." "With what?" Megan snapped. As they rested, Liam noticed something strange about the creek's surface. It reflected not the present, but scenes from the past. A group of hikers, identical to themselves, walking the same trail. "What is this?" Liam asked, his voice shaking. The images changed, showing the hikers being dragged into the shadows by unseen forces. "It's showing us what's going to happen," Emily said. The forest wasn't just alive, it was sentient, and it had already decided their fate. The group stumbled upon a massive stone altar covered in moss and bloodstains. "This is where it ends," Ethan said grimly. The whispers intensified, forming a single commanding voice. "Give us one, and the rest may leave." "No," Emily said firmly. "We're not sacrificing anyone." But Megan stepped forward, her expression hollow. "Maybe it's the only way." Before anyone could stop her, she climbed onto the altar. The forest grew still as Megan lay on the altar, her eyes filled with resignation. "Take me," she said. The shadows surrounded her, their forms writhing. As they consumed her, the forest seemed to sigh, the whispers fading into silence. The remaining three watched in horror as Megan disappeared, her sacrifice complete. The path back to the trailhead reappeared, illuminated by a faint, otherworldly glow. "Let's go," Ethan said, his voice shaking. But as they ran, Emily noticed the shadows still following them, their movements slower, but no less menacing. "They're not letting us leave," she realized. At the edge of the forest, the group turned to face the shadows. "We have to fight," Ethan said, grabbing a branch. The shadows advanced, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. But as the group braced for the attack, the sun rose, its light piercing the canopy. The shadows recoiled, melting into the ground. The three survivors emerged from the forest, their bodies battered and their minds fractured.
When they told the townspeople what had happened, no one believed them, but the whispers in the woods stopped, and no one dared venture near the forest again.
Years later, a new group of hikers approached the Whispering Woods, drawn by the legends. As they stepped into the forest, the whispers returned, soft and inviting. The forest had been patient, and now it was ready to claim more souls. Story 15. Perched on the edge of a cliff overlooking the ocean stood the glass house, a modern architectural marvel of steel and transparent panes. It was said to be both beautiful and unnerving, a place where the line between interior and exterior blurred.
The house had a sinister reputation. Its previous owners had all disappeared under mysterious circumstances, their belongings left untouched, and their lives erased.
No one knew why the house remained on the market for years, its sleek walls reflecting the emptiness inside. No one, that is, until architect Olivia Pierce purchased it, determined to turn the glass house into her dream home. Olivia had always been drawn to the glass house. Its stark beauty, its clean lines, its panoramic views, all of it called to her. When the real estate agent hesitated to sell it to her, mentioning the house's dark past, Olivia laughed. "I don't believe in ghosts," she said, signing the papers. Moving day was bright and cheerful. Olivia unloaded her boxes, marveling at how the sunlight danced through the glass walls, painting the floors with shifting patterns. But as night fell, the house took on a different aura. The glass, once inviting, now felt like a barrier trapping her inside. The first incident happened on Olivia's second night. As she unpacked in the living room, she caught a glimpse of movement in the glass. At first, she thought it was her reflection, but the figure was wrong. It moved independently, standing still while she shifted. She turned, heart racing, but the room was empty. Shaking off the unease, Olivia blamed her exhaustion. "It's just the way the light plays tricks," she muttered to herself. But she couldn't ignore the feeling of being watched. The next morning, Olivia noticed smudges on the glass walls, handprints pressed against the inside. She frowned. She'd cleaned every surface meticulously after moving in, and no one else had been in the house. Shrugging it off as an oversight, she wiped the smudges away, but by nightfall they reappeared, more numerous this time, as if someone, or something, had been crawling across the glass.
Determined to shake the eerie feeling, Olivia invited her friend and fellow architect, Lauren, to visit.
"This place is stunning," Lauren said, admiring the view, "but it feels cold." As they chatted over wine, Lauren's gaze drifted to the glass wall behind Olivia. Her face paled. "Don't move," Lauren whispered. "What?" Olivia asked, confused. "There's someone behind you." Olivia turned quickly, but the room was empty. She looked back at Lauren, whose expression was now one of embarrassment. "I must have imagined it," Lauren said, though her voice was shaky. That night, Olivia decided to dig into the house's past. She found articles detailing the disappearances of its previous owners. A writer who moved in to finish his novel and vanished, leaving the manuscript incomplete. A young couple who disappeared within a month of their honeymoon. A family of 4, their last dinner still set on the table when the police arrived. Each case had one thing in common: no signs of forced entry, no struggle, and no bodies. As Olivia scrolled through the articles, she caught movement out of the corner of her eye. Looking up, she saw her reflection in the glass, but something was wrong. Her reflection wasn't mimicking her movements. It stood still, its head tilted slightly, watching her. Her breath hitched as the reflection took a step forward, toward her. Olivia screamed, knocking over her laptop. When she looked again, the reflection was gone, replaced by her real one. Desperate for answers, Olivia called the real estate agent. "You didn't tell me everything about this house," she said, her voice trembling. The agent sighed. "What do you want to know?"
"What's wrong with it?" Olivia demanded.
The agent hesitated. "They say the house is cursed, that it takes something from everyone who lives there. I didn't think you'd believe me." "What does it take?" Olivia asked. "No one knows," the agent replied, "but it always starts with the glass." Over the next few days, Olivia felt the house closing in on her. The glass walls seemed to reflect more than just her image. They reflected her fears, her regrets, her darkest thoughts. She started avoiding the windows, drawing the curtains in a futile attempt to block out the glass. But no matter where she went, she felt exposed. The whispers began soon after. They were faint at first, barely audible, but unmistakable. Voices echoing from the glass, calling her name. One night, Olivia discovered a locked door she hadn't noticed before. It led to a small, windowless room with mirrored walls. At the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it rested a glass orb. As she approached, the whispers grew louder. She hesitated, then reached out to touch the orb. Images flooded her mind, visions of the house's previous residents, their faces twisted in terror as they were pulled into the glass. Olivia staggered back, her hand trembling. The orb pulsed faintly, as if alive. The next day, Lauren called Olivia. "I can't stop thinking about what I saw in your house," Lauren said. "There's something wrong with that place. You need to leave." "I can't," Olivia said, her voice hollow. "What not?" Lauren pressed. Olivia glanced at the glass walls, her reflection staring back at her with hollow eyes. "It won't let me." That night, Olivia awoke to the sound of shattering glass. She bolted upright, her heart racing. In the living room, shards of glass littered the floor, though none of the walls were broken. The air grew heavy, and a figure stepped out from the largest pane of glass. It was her reflection, but twisted, its features distorted, and its eyes glowing faintly. It was Monica whispering, and there was a soft sound, thin and symmetrical about her. "You invited us," the figure said, its voice a distorted echo of her own. Olivia backed away, her hands shaking. "What do you want?" "To become," the figure replied. The entity advanced, its form flickering between solidity and shadow. Every mirror, every window reflected its image, surrounding Olivia. Grabbing a heavy vase, she smashed one of the glass walls, but the entity only laughed. "You can't destroy us," it said. "We are the house, and now so are you." Desperate, Olivia remembered the glass orb in the mirrored room. She sprinted to it, the whispers growing deafening. As the entity closed in, Olivia grabbed the orb. It burned in her hands, but she didn't let go. "Let him go!" she screamed, her voice reverberating through the house. The orb pulsed, its light growing brighter. The entity howled, its form splintering into fragments. The glass walls shattered, the sound like thunder, and the house fell silent. The next morning, Olivia stumbled out of the house, her body weak but her spirit intact. The glass house stood behind her, its sleek walls now dull and lifeless. She didn't look back as she drove away, vowing never to return. Months later, a new buyer marveled at the beauty of the glass house, signing the papers without hesitation. And as they unpacked their belongings, the glass walls shimmered faintly, reflecting more than just a room.
The house was waiting, its hunger never truly sated.
Story 16? Beneath the crumbling ruins of Greyhaven Abbey, hidden from the eyes of time, lay a crypt that no one dared to speak of. The crypt was said to house something older than the abbey itself, something that predated the town, the country, even recorded history. Legends whispered of a curse, of restless souls trapped within the crypt's cold stone walls. They spoke of a guardian that watched over the dead, punishing any who dared disturb their slumber. For centuries, the crypt remained sealed, but curiosity is a dangerous thing, and when a team of archaeologists uncovered the ancient entrance, they unleashed something far worse than they had imagined. Dr. Eleanor Price had spent her career studying forgotten places. When she received word of the crypt's discovery beneath Greyhaven Abbey, she couldn't resist. The abbey, once a thriving monastery, had been abandoned for over a century. Its walls were crumbling, its stained glass shattered. The crypt, hidden beneath layers of rubble, had been found by accident during a routine excavation. Eleanor and her team, Marcus, the historian, Claire, the graduate assistant, and Tom, the field technician, arrived, eager to uncover the crypt's secrets. "This is incredible," Marcus said, examining the ornate carvings around the entrance. "These symbols, they are pre-Christian. This place is ancient." Eleanor felt a chill as she approached the heavy stone door. Something about the air was wrong. Too still, too cold. It took hours to clear the debris blocking the entrance. As the team worked, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. When the door finally creaked open, a rush of stale air escaped, carrying with it the scent of decay. Inside, the crypt was dark and silent, its walls lined with ancient carvings. At the center was a stone sarcophagus, its surface etched with symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. "This is unlike anything I've ever seen," Marcus said, his voice tinged with awe. Eleanor nodded, though her unease grew with every step. As the team examined the carvings, Claire found an inscription near the sarcophagus. "It's in Latin," she said, running her fingers over the words. "It says, 'Disturb not the eternal watcher, for the price is thy soul.'" Tom scoffed. Typical grave warning, meant to scare off tomb robbers. Eleanor frowned. "Still, let's be careful. We don't know what we're dealing with." But curiosity outweighed caution, and Tom began prying open the sarcophagus. The lid of the sarcophagus was heavy, requiring all four of them to lift it. Inside was a skeleton, its bones impossibly white and its skull adorned with a golden circlet. Whoever this was, they were important, Marcus said. As he reached for the circlet, a sudden gust of wind roared through the crypt, extinguishing their lanterns. The team froze as a deep, guttural growl echoed around them. The temperature plummeted, and the walls seemed to close in. "What was that?" Claire whispered, her voice shaking. Before anyone could answer, the skeleton's hollow eyes began to glow. The team fled the crypt, their fear palpable. Outside, the air felt heavier, the sky unnaturally dark. Eleanor tried to calm the group. "We'll regroup and return tomorrow. Maybe it was just the air pressure." But as night fell, strange things began to happen. Claire woke screaming, clawing at her throat. She claimed she felt hands choking her, though no one was there. Tom's tools were found scattered, their metal rusted and corroded, as if aged a century overnight. And Eleanor heard whispers in her tent, faint but insistent. "Leave now." Determined to understand what they had unleashed, Eleanor delved into the history of Greyhaven Abbey. She discovered that the abbey had been built over a much older site, a pagan temple dedicated to an unnamed deity. The monks had tried to cleanse the area, but many of them had gone mad, claiming to see visions of a watcher in the dark. The crypt, it seemed, was not a burial chamber, but a prison. Despite their fear, the team returned to the crypt, hoping to document their findings. Inside, the sarcophagus was empty. The skeleton, once pristine, was gone, its golden circlet lying on the ground. "This isn't possible," Marcus said, his voice trembling. Eleanor picked up the circlet, her fingers tingling as she held it. A vision flashed in her mind. A towering figure with glowing eyes standing over a sea of bodies. "We need to leave," she said. That night, the camp was attacked. Shadows moved through the trees, their forms twisting and shifting. The team heard whispers, laughter, and guttural growls. Tom disappeared first, dragged screaming into the darkness. When the others found him, his body was contorted, his face frozen in terror. "This is a warning," Claire said, tears streaming down her face. "It's punishing us." Back in the crypt, the glowing symbols on the walls began to pulse. The team realized they had activated something ancient and malevolent. The Watcher appeared, a massive shadowy figure with glowing eyes and skeletal hands. It moved slowly, deliberately, its presence filling the crypt with dread. "You have trespassed," it said, its voice a rumble that shook the ground. "Now you will pay." Eleanor devised a plan to seal the crypt. The carving suggested a ritual, a way to contain the Watcher and prevent it from escaping. But the ritual required a sacrifice. "I'll do it," Marcus said, his face pale but resolute. "It's my fault we opened this place." "No," Eleanor said, "we'll find another way." But time was running out. The team prepared the ritual using the golden circlet and the symbols on the walls. As they chanted, the Watcher grew more aggressive, its shadowy form attacking them with tendrils of darkness. Marcus stepped forward, placing the circlet on his head. The symbols flared and the Watcher howled in rage. "You cannot contain me forever," it growled. But as the ritual completed, the Watcher's form began to fade, its screams echoing into silence. When the ritual ended, Marcus was gone. The sarcophagus sealed itself, the carvings dimming. Eleanor and Claire stood in the silent crypt, their bodies battered and their spirits broken. "We can't let anyone else find this place," Eleanor said. They collapsed the entrance, burying the crypt once more. Years later, rumors of the crypt persisted, drawing treasure hunters and thrill seekers. One night, a pair of explorers found the collapsed entrance and began digging. As they broke through the rubble, a faint growl echoed from within. The Watcher was waiting, its hunger undiminished. Story 17. There is a place in the desert where the earth opens into darkness, a vast, gaping chasm known only as the Abyss. It is said that no light can penetrate its depths, no sound can escape its confines. The locals whispered of voices that echoed from within, luring travelers to their doom. Some claimed it was a natural phenomenon. Others swore it was a gateway to another world. Few had dared to approach it, and even fewer returned. But for a group of spelunkers chasing the ultimate thrill, the abyss was irresistible. Lena Kessler, a seasoned cave diver, had always been drawn to the unknown. When she heard about the abyss, she immediately gathered a team of explorers: Ryan, the geologist, Max, the tech-savvy navigator, and Danielle, her closest friend and fellow adventurer. They arrived at the edge of the chasm at dawn, the desert sun casting long shadows across the jagged rocks. The abyss yawned before them, a void so dark it seemed to swallow the light. "It's beautiful," Lena murmured, peering over the edge. Ryan frowned. "It's not natural. Look at the way the walls are perfectly smooth, like they've been carved." Max set up their gear, his drone hovering over the chasm. "Let's find out what's down there," he said, grinning. The team descended into the darkness, their ropes creaking under the weight. The air grew colder as they descended, the sunlight fading into an unnatural twilight. The only sound was the rhythmic scraping of their gear against the rock. "Does anyone else feel like we're being watched?" Danielle asked, her voice echoing faintly. Ryan laughed nervously. "It's just the acoustics. Sound carries differently in places like this." But as they reached the first ledge, they heard it, a faint whisper, indistinct but unmistakable. "Did you hear that?" Lena asked, scanning the darkness. "It's just the wind," Max said, though his voice betrayed his unease. The team continued deeper, the chasm widening into a massive cavern. Stalactites hung like jagged teeth, and strange patterns adorned the walls, spirals, glyphs, and shapes that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. This isn't natural," Ryan said, running his hand over the carvings. "These markings are ancient, maybe even pre-human." As Max set up his equipment, the drone's camera feed flickered. On the screen, a shadow moved across the cavern floor, too large and too quick to be one of them. "Did you see that?" Max asked, his hands trembling. "No one's here but us," Lena said firmly. But the whispering grew louder, echoing through the cavern like a chorus. The team set up camp on a wide ledge, their lanterns casting flickering light. As they ate, Danielle noticed something strange. Their voices were no longer syncing with their movements. When Ryan spoke, his words echoed seconds later, as if time itself were bending. "This place is messing with us," Danielle said. "We should leave." Lena shook her head. "We've come too far. We'll rest and head deeper in the morning." That night, Danielle woke to a chilling sound, a distorted version of her own voice, calling her name from the darkness. The next morning, the team ventured deeper into the abyss. The cavern narrowed into a winding passage, its walls lined with what appeared to be handprints, too large and too numerous to belong to humans. Ryan examined them closely, his flashlight revealing faint traces of red. "This isn't paint," he said. "It's blood." Lena felt a growing unease. "Let's keep moving." But the passage seemed to twist endlessly, leading them in circles. The whispering grew louder, now forming words. "Turn back." The team searched frantically, their flashlights casting long, flickering beams across the jagged walls of the abyss. "Max!" Lena shouted again, her voice trembling. No response came, but the whispers grew louder, now unmistakably calling their names. Danielle gripped Lena's arm. "We have to go back. Something's not right here." Ryan crouched near a scuff mark on the ground. "His gear. "It's like he was dragged," he said, his voice low. The mark led deeper into the abyss, disappearing into a narrow crevice too small for any of them to follow. Lena clenched her fists. "We're not leaving him. He's still down here." But as the whispers rose to an almost deafening level, a cold certainty crept into her mind. Max was gone. As the 3 remaining team members pressed onward, the abyss seemed to grow darker, the air heavier. Their flashlights began to flicker, their batteries inexplicably draining faster than they should. "Stay close," Lena instructed, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her. The path opened into another cavern, this one lined with strange crystalline formations that refracted their flashlight beams into fractured rainbows. In the center of the cavern was a deep pool of black water, its surface unnervingly still. Danielle froze. "Did you hear that?" The whispers shifted, growing clearer. They weren't just random murmurs anymore. They were Max's voice. "Help me, please," it called, faint but unmistakable. Lena stepped closer to the pool, her heart pounding. "Max? Is that you?" The water rippled, and for a moment Lena saw his face beneath the surface, distorted, his mouth open in a silent scream. Ryan grabbed her arm, pulling her back. That's not him," he said. It's this place. It's using him." The cavern walls began to tremble, loose rocks falling as an ominous hum filled the air. The crystalline formations shimmered, and the shadows in the room deepened. Then they saw them, figures emerging from the far side of the cavern. They moved unnaturally, their forms humanoid but elongated. Their skin was pale and translucent, their limbs too long and their heads devoid of features except for deep, hollow voids where eyes should have been. "They've been watching us," Ryan whispered, his voice barely audible. The creatures stopped, tilting their heads as if listening. Then they moved, their steps eerily silent despite their size. "Run!" Lena shouted. The team sprinted back into the winding passages, the creatures pursuing them with unnerving speed. The echoes of their own frantic breaths and pounding footsteps seemed to bounce back at them, amplified and distorted. "This way!" Danielle yelled, pointing to an offshoot tunnel. They turned sharply, but the walls of the passage seemed to shift, the layout of the labyrinth changing before their eyes. "We're trapped," Ryan said, gasping for air. "No, we're not," Lena snapped. "We just have to keep moving." The whispers returned, now screaming in overlapping voices. "Stay, become, join us." The team stumbled into another cavern, this one unlike anything they'd seen before. The walls were covered in intricate carvings, depicting figures being pulled into the abyss by shadowy tendrils. At the center of the cavern stood a massive obelisk, its surface glowing faintly with pulsating light. The carvings on the obelisk depicted the same creatures that had been chasing them, their forms intertwined with those of humans. Ryan approached it cautiously, running his fingers over the symbols. "This isn't just a natural formation," he said. "This is a shrine." "A shrine to what?" Danielle asked. Ryan's face darkened. "To them. They weren't always here. They were brought here, called by someone or something." The creatures entered the cavern, their hollow eyes fixed on the team. Danielle backed away, trembling. "They're not gonna let us leave." Lena stepped in front of her, holding up a flare. "Stay back!" But the creatures didn't flinch. Instead, they stopped and tilted their heads in unison, as if waiting. Ryan's eyes widened as he pieced it together. They need something, or someone. What are you talking about? Lena demanded. They're not mindless, Ryan said. They're guarding this place, and if we want to leave, they'll only let us go if we give them what they want. Danielle's face went pale. Do you mean a sacrifice? The creatures moved closer, their forms shifting in the dim light. We don't have a choice, Ryan said, his voice breaking. Lena shook her head. No, we're not sacrificing anyone. But Ryan's gaze flicked to Danielle, and before Lena could stop him, he lunged, shoving Danielle toward the creatures. No! Danielle screamed, clawing at the ground as the creatures surrounded her. Lena grabbed Ryan, throwing him against the wall. What the hell is wrong with you? I'm trying to save us, he shouted. Danielle's screams echoed as the creatures dragged her into the shadows, her voice fading into the abyss. Lena stared at Ryan, her chest heaving with rage and grief. You didn't save us, she said coldly. You just made things worse. The creatures returned, their forms darker, more solid. The whispers in the cavern grew deafening, their tone furious. They're still coming, Ryan said, his voice trembling. They don't want one of us, Lena realized. They want all of us. The obelisk began to glow brighter, its carvings shifting. Lena understood now. It wasn't a shrine. It was a beacon, calling more of the creatures to the surface. Lena grabbed a flare from her pack, its red light cutting through the gloom. What are you doing? Ryan asked, panicking. I'm ending this, Lena said. She sprinted toward the obelisk, the creatures closing in. Igniting the flare, she slammed it against the glowing surface. The obelisk shuddered, cracks spreading across its surface. A low, guttural roar filled the cavern as the creatures recoiled. Ryan screamed as the ground beneath them began to collapse. Lena ran, the cavern crumbling around her. She didn't look back as the obelisk shattered, releasing a blinding light that consumed the creatures. She emerged from the abyss just as the entrance caved in, sealing the darkness below. Ryan didn't make it. Weeks later, Lena sat in her small apartment, staring at the photographs they had taken during the expedition. The obelisk, the carvings, the faces of her friends, all gone now, buried beneath the desert. But late at night, she still heard the whispers, faint and insistent, calling her back to the abyss. And somewhere deep below the surface, the creatures waited,